Hey everybody. In this lecture, we're going to continue talking about confidence men. In the last lecture, we discussed the context for a sort of irrational fear in the middle 1800s over con men. And I was trying to explain the context that Haltunen describes in her book, going back to the American Revolution and the early Republic, and this understanding that to survive the American Republic is going to require virtuous citizens, and this continual fear since then that if there is decline of virtue in the citizenry, America won't be able to survive. And by the middle 1800s, there was this growing fear of confidence men and this idea that interaction with con men was going to bring about a decline in virtue of American citizens. And the irrational nature of this fear that there actually wasn't any sort of statistical increase of con men in the middle 1800s, and people that are swindled by con men do not actually lose their virtue. But nonetheless, that was the fear. And towards the end of the lecture, I told you that what was really going on was that this fear of the confidence man was really a fear of broad changes going on in the middle 19th century. Fear of social change, fear of economic change, fear of political change. And the con man became sort of a boogeyman upon which people could project their fear of change. All right. And so in this lecture, we're going to start talking specifically about these social, economic, and political changes and what they had to do with con men. Okay. Haltunen in her book characterizes three distinct types of con men. Okay. Now again, the Victorians were often irrationally fearful about con men. But nonetheless, when the Victorians thought of con men, they tended to think of three different types of cons that could happen to them. And so what Karen Haltunen does in her book is she creates categories for each of these three. The Victorians themselves didn't use this terminology I'm about to describe, this terminology that Haltunen in her book describes. Right? But nonetheless, each of these con men represent a distinct kind of fear about con men. So Haltunen talks about three types of con men: the urban companion, the gambler, and the demagogue. Those three types of con men. And so now what we're going to do for the rest of the lecture is talk about each of these types of con men. And what's most important about them is not so much how they tried to swindle people, but what fear they represented in the population. All right, that's what's really interested. That's what Haltunen's really interested in. So let's, I switched these slides around for some reason. Okay, let's start with the urban companion. Okay. The urban companion was well-dressed, well-mannered, well-spoken, and would often approach a newcomer, leaving rural areas and coming to the big city. When we describe the urban companion, one way to think about it is imagine Benjamin Franklin leaving Boston and coming to Philadelphia. Now, Franklin was going from a big city to a new big city, but nonetheless, this holds up. Remember how clueless Benjamin Franklin was when he got to Philadelphia? Remember all the bad decisions he was making? He was paying for stuff he didn't have to pay for. He was buying more stuff than he needed. He was walking in circles. He was he was just following random people in the street and then falling asleep in a church. Remember that the whole point of the story was how clueless he was when he got to Philadelphia, and yet how he rose up and made a success for himself. Now imagine a different kind of story, one in which Franklin is befriended by a well-dressed, well-mannered, well-spoken person that pretended to want to help Benjamin Franklin. Think of how vulnerable Franklin might have been to that. He was making so many other bad decisions. The urban companion preyed upon young people, particularly young men, because it principally would have been young men leaving their homes and coming to the big city and trying to con them. Often these young men had saved money and knew they were going to need some money when they got to the city. They were clueless. They didn't know anything. They often needed jobs. They needed housing. They didn't have friends. The urban companion preyed upon these newcomers that came to the city. Now, I've been talking a lot about how the fear of con men was somewhat irrational for the Victorians. That's not to say there weren't con men. There were con men. What was irrational for the Victorians was that they were overestimating the threat of this. But nonetheless, there were con men. And they did sometimes prey upon young, naive people coming into the city and would swindle them. Okay. And so, they would befriend these young men that would come to these cities, New York, Philadelphia, Boston. They would offer jobs, they would offer housing, they would offer companionship, they would offer riches, excitement, and then they would swindle this young man. All right, they would con him, they would trick him. Once they gained the confidence of this young newcomer to the city, they would rip him off. All right, that's how the con worked. Now, this is where we get to the important stuff. Did this happen? Were there examples of this? Yeah, sure. Guess what? This still happens today. People come to the big city. They're naive. They don't know. They get befriended by bad people. Bad people rip them off. This happened in ancient Rome. This happens in contemporary Los Angeles. There was nothing new about this in the Victorian age. So why were the Victorians so fearful of this? What were they really worried about? Well, what Haltunen argues is that what the Victorians were really interested in isn't so much some young kids, some young men really, were getting ripped off and having their property swindled by con men. What they were really worried about was social change. That there was a really significant social change that was happening. As young people were increasingly leaving small farming communities and heading off to the big city, there was a lack of social control that was being placed on these young men as they got to the big city. Haltunen talks about traditionally in those small farming villages. Again, you could think about a place like Denham. Massachusetts was run by the Puritans, and that was a Puritan community. But there were lots of other similarly structured farming villages all around at first colonial America and then the early Republic. And so these young men were leaving these small farming villages and going off to the big city. Well, back in that small farming village, there were various layers of social control that kept young men in line. Okay, first of all, you had your father. Okay, your father not only had the normal kind of patriarchal authority. You don't want to disappoint your father. You don't want to make your father angry. You want the respect of your father. But the father also controlled land that you hope to someday inherit when he either decides to stop farming or when he dies. And so if you disobeyed your father, if you were particularly problematic for your father could cut you out of the will. He could not give you that land that was going to be so useful for your success. Well, if you were going to the big city and you didn't want to be a farmer, then this threat didn't really hold anymore. You didn't really care. You didn't want to be a farmer anyway. Go ahead, old man. Keep your farmland. I'm not interested in it anyway. So this is one layer of authority that started to disappear when you went to the big city. Your dad's not there. His threats of cutting you off from inheriting the farmland don't really matter anymore. What if you were like Benjamin Franklin, coming from one city and going to another city? Well, you had the apprenticeship system. And we talked about that. Remember, one of the reasons I emphasized the nature of apprenticeship in our Franklin unit was I wanted you to understand it was a legally binding contract. When you became an apprentice, you now had a master that you were contractually obligated to work for until the age of 21. You lived with your master. You worked for your master. If you tried to flee your master, you could get arrested, thrown into jail. Now, Franklin was smart and clever about it, so he was able to get out of his apprenticeship, but most apprentices couldn't. This was another layer of control, apprenticeship, to train and discipline young men, to keep them in line. Notice the master, if he wanted to end the apprenticeship, he could. But the young man, he was forced to stay in there. This was a type of social control to keep young men in line in an earlier age. But with the coming of industrialism, with the coming of capitalism, the apprentice system starts to break down. You didn't need to be an apprentice to learn a skill or a craft. You could just go and work in a factory, right? You didn't need to waste years learning a trade or a craft for free when you could get a job in a factory. So did apprenticeships still exist in the 1800s? Yeah, they still existed, but they dramatically declined. And so that was another fear. As these young men were heading off into the cities, not only were their fathers not there, and the threat of their fathers cutting them off because of land that helped control these young men, but also these young men were not as likely to enter into apprentice crafts that, once again, would have put an authority figure over them to keep them in line. And then finally, when these young men were coming from small villages, you had a town minister. And a town minister who knew everybody in town. And everybody in town knew the minister. And, you could think about the population in the town often being like spies for the minister. If you were a young man in that small town and you were acting like a fool, you were gambling, you were drinking, you were carousing with women, word would get back to the minister. And the minister had no sort of legal authority over you, but, it was embarrassing. There was guilt involved. The minister could talk to you and pull you aside, could shame you in the community. And so you might restrict some of your bad behavior in that little small farming village because you didn't want to run the risk of alienating the minister, of feeling guilty about that. Well, when these young men went to the big city, that small town minister wasn't there anymore. Now, don't get me wrong. There were churches. There were lots of churches in the big cities. There were lots of ministers in those big cities. But now in the middle 1800s, these big cities are worlds of strangers. Yeah, there was a minister and there was a church, and you might even go to that church on Sundays. But after church was over, that minister wasn't keeping track of you anymore. He didn't have a city full of spies. He didn't know what you were doing on Saturday night and who you were doing it with. And so you could be more inclined to do some bad things without fear of word getting back to the minister, without the minister making you feel guilty, without the minister shaming you in the community. Okay. There was a lot of social control on you in small towns, and when the apprentice system was widely spread in big cities. Parents kept you in line. Ministers kept you in line. Apprentice masters kept you in line. But by the middle 1800s, as these young men were leaving their rural environments, sometimes other big cities, and coming to new big cities, it was an anonymous world of strangers. No father, no apprentice master, no ministers that could keep track of you. There were ministers, but not ones that could keep track of you in that small town environment. So there was tremendous fear about these young men. Who's keeping these kids in line? Who's watching them? Who's controlling them? Remember, if the citizenry did not maintain its virtue, there was fear the American Republic would be lost. And now we have a growing society, or changing society, where there's fear of this next generation is not being kept in line by their fathers, by their apprentice masters, by their ministers. You have a bunch of young men heading off to the city by themselves, spending time with other young men. Who's controlling them? Who's watching them? Who's making sure they maintain their virtue? Social control is being lost, or at least that was the fear. One of the other things that Haltunen tells you when she's discussing this is that, look, in the 1700s, there were some young men that left rural areas and moved to big cities. There were men like Benjamin Franklin who left one city and went to another city. But in the 1700s, when they did this, they were often older. They were often in their mid-20s or late 20s when they would leave a rural area and go to the big city. By the 1800s, young men are leaving earlier, younger. Now they're coming in their late teens, in their early 20s. And trust me when I tell you this, there's a big difference between you in your late teens and your late 20s. You're just more mature. You at least should be. You have more experience. Increasingly, we're finding out your brain has fully developed by the late 20s, particularly for young men. In your late teens, early 20s, the male brain is still sort of developing impulse control, right? And so not only are young men coming into an urban environment, a world of strangers, without fathers, without apprentice masters, without ministers that can keep track of them, but they're doing it at a younger age, as teenagers, as people in their early 20s. All of this was concerning to the Victorians. All right. So what Haltunen argues is that what's really going on with this fear of confidence men, particularly in this example, the fear of what she calls the urban companion, these con men that prey upon young people coming into the city. What's really going on is not so much a fear of young people getting swindled, but rather a fear of a society where young men are not being controlled or not being disciplined, where social control is lost. And the next generation is going to grow up kind of like wild animals. And that's going to be the end of American virtue. The fear of the urban companion is a fear of social change. This is why I started this unit talking about change in the 1800s. Unless you understand this change, rise of capitalism, the rise of urbanization, the rise of industrialism, social mobility, you kind of don't get what Haltunen's talking about in the book, right? Okay, so that's the urban companion, fear of social change. Let's talk about our next, there we go. Let's talk about our next type of con man that Haltunen describes, and that's the gambler. The gambler was a con artist who used crooked games of chance, cheated at gambling to swindle you out of your money. Gambling was really popular in these days. You know, there just wasn't that much stuff to do, and one of the exciting things men could do was gamble. You know, it was just something available you could do. So gambling was quite common at this time. And one type of con artist was the crooked gambler who would fix games of chance to take your money, not really providing you a fair opportunity to win in this game of chance. And so once again, the gambler would meet some person, usually a young person, a young man, offer to bring this young man into an exciting game of chance, allow the young man to think he has a fair chance to win, and then to swindle the young man and take his money. Okay. Did this happen? Was this a real thing? Yeah, sure. As long as there's been societies, there has been gambling. And as long as there's been gambling, there have been some people that tried to cheat at it. It's not that there were no con men, but like I keep repeating, it's the exaggerated concern for this threat that Haltunen is interested. Why were people so scared of the gambler? Well, Haltunen argues this has to do with changes in the economy. If the fear of the urban companion was about fear of social change, fear of the gambler was fear about economic change. And this is where we get back to our discussion of capitalism. We talked about how our Puritan friends had a very simple, basic economy for the most part in Denham. Not a lot of cash, mostly subsistence farmers, not a lot of changing money, mostly barter and trade among neighbors. Very communal, very cooperative kind of economy, right? As a Puritan farmer, I want my neighbors to succeed because they will have more surplus and we could trade. And they want me to be successful so that I have more to trade. But as we talked about with the coming of capitalism, capitalism is very individualistic and competitive. And now I no longer necessarily look at my neighbor as someone I want to succeed, but rather somebody I'm trying to overcome. That's somebody I want to defeat. And as we talked about, this was a big transition. This was a big transition in mentality. And there was a certain fear of a world of competition, that an economy based on competition. One of the fears about capitalism is that everybody's in competition with one another, just like in a game of chance. we're in competition with one another. And as we get to the capitalism of the middle 1800s, there was this growing fear among some Victorians that our entire economy seems to be just like another form of gambling. Right? Think of the stock market, and think of how investing in the stock market has a lot of similarities to playing poker. Right? An investor identifies a company that she or he thinks is going to grow and be more successful. They buy stock, and through no effort on their own, either succeed or fail based on the success of that company. They don't make anything, they don't do anything, they simply invest some money and sit back and see what happens. It kind of sounds like poker, right? In poker, you're dealt cards, and you look at your cards, and you determine at that point, do my cards look like they could potentially win this hand of poker? Sort of like a company, or do these cards look like they have good fundamentals? Is there growth potential in these cards I'm looking at? If yes, I'm going to invest, just like buying stock in a company. And then you sit back, and you don't really do anything. And at the end of it, you either win or you lose. You were either right about your cards or you were wrong about your cards. That's what it kind of sounded like. The entire capitalist economy seemed to some people to be just like gambling. And remember when we talked about Republican ideology and why the American revolutionaries believed they had won the war against the British? We're hardworking. We're virtuous. We're hard. And the English lost because they're decadent and they're lazy and they're corrupt. Gambling is a kind of lazy form of acquiring wealth. Today, when you're warned not to gamble, it's often in terms of because you could become addicted, because you could get too deep into this world, and most forms of gambling are mathematically favorable to the house. So the more you do it, the greater the probability you're going to lose. But there is an older argument that we don't really hear much about these days about gambling, and that is, even if you could win, for example, poker is a game where you could actually, it's a more skill-based form of gambling, and there is no built-in house advantage to poker. Some people actually are good at it and can make a living at it. But there's an argument even against that, being a professional poker player. And the traditional argument is it's a bad way of life because you don't make anything. You don't create anything. You simply sit at a table, put money on that table, and money moves around that table. It goes to some people and it goes to other people. But at the end of a day of playing poker, nothing has been built. No services have been rendered. You know, when a hairstylist goes to work, people get their hair cut and they leave the beauty parlor feeling good because their hair got cut. When I go in for a day of work, I share knowledge, and hopefully students are smarter after they're done. When a steel worker gets done with a day of work, steel has been produced. When a worker in a factory making automobiles gets done with the day, there are cars that have been built. Nothing gets built or made or serviced on a poker table. There's nothing productive about it. Wealth just moves. That was an old school traditional argument against gambling. Nothing is produced, nothing is made. And there were some people that viewed capitalism that way, that it's a kind of passive income. You don't do anything. You just sit there, you invest some money, and through no effort on your own, more money magically appears. And so the fear of the gambler wasn't simply that, oh, some young men are getting ripped off in poker tables. That's always happened. There have always been games of chance and always people that have gotten ripped off by crooked gamblers. What the real broader fear by the Victorian age was that the gamblers seemed to represent a bigger trend that was going on. A trend that our whole damn economy kind of seems like gambling. And often, oh, by the way, kind of rigged gambling. Because sometimes those wealthy people, they're better at it. And that our whole economy just seems like guessing. And people can get ripped off in this. In the old days where you could be a farmer and work your land and produce and raise crops, that old way of life is going away. And now we're in a competitive economic society where we're all at each other and trying to dominate others. And sometimes not even through hard work, just by being passive and investing. The fear of the gambler was not a rational fear of an increase in con men and gambling. The fear of the gambler was of a broader economic shift in society. So if the urban companion reflected a fear of social change, a decline in social control over young people, the fear of the gambler was the fear of economic change in the 19th century, that with the rise of capitalism, a new kind of passive income that can be manipulated by the powerful is now the nature of our economy that we're in. That was frightening to some people. Okay. And then finally, our third con man. That's the demagogue. Okay. The demagogue is kind of qualitatively different than the first two. All right. The first two was directly about money. The urban companion's going to con you out of your money. The gambler was going to con you out of your money. The demagogue is more about taking away your political power. Okay. Let's start with the definition of what a demagogue is. A demagogue is a political leader or a politician that uses fear to gain political support from people. Okay. The most classic example of a demagogue would be Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler used fear of Jews and other minority groups to consolidate power in Germany. Okay. A demagogue doesn't try to get you to vote or give political power to him or her through appeals to rational reasons. Rather, they try to scare you, terrify you of what the world will be like without them. And so out of fear, you wind up supporting them. Okay, that's a demagogue. A demagogue is any political leader that's constantly using fear. That their main appeal to you as a voter is, you need to vote for me, because if you don't, bad things will happen to you. Or you need to continue supporting me as your dictator, because if I am no longer running things, bad things will happen to you and your family. Okay, that's what a demagogue is. A demagogue uses fear. Okay. There was a growing concern about American politicians that were worse than older generations of leaders in America. By the time you get to the 1830s, there's this growing fear that politicians today are much worse than they were before. That there's a new generation of politicians, and they are tricking people into voting for them. And therefore, things do not look good for our country if these kinds of people continue to get elected to office. Now, what's going on with this? What's the fear here? Well, it has to do with the changing nature of politics in America. And I've already talked about this a bit, going back to the Puritans. Remember when we talked about the Puritans and we discussed voting? I told you that the Puritans didn't really have a sense of representation when they were voting. That when the Puritans voted, they didn't really imagine the leader was going to represent them. I told you this was a deferential style of politics. You were expected to, once you voted for the leader, you were expected to defer to the better judgment of the leaders. Well, in the 1820s, this starts to change. And I talked about this a bit before in our Enlightenment unit. By the time we get to the 1820s, there's been a change in voting rights. Prior to the 1820s, you not only had to be an adult, you not only had to be white, you not only had to be male to vote, but you had to own property. And this meant that voting was really only available for the rich and the solidly middle class. They were the only ones that got to vote. White men that were rich, adult, and own some property. Rich and middle class. But that restriction was dropped about property, and that opened up the ability for poor white men and working class white men to start voting. Now remember who the Victorians were. The Victorians were the middle class. The Victorians and their parents and their grandparents and their great-grandparents, for the most part, had always been able to vote. They were coming from a middle-class tradition. So they had always felt like their type of people had a voice in American politics. But as we get to the beginning of this Victorian age, right at this beginning of this Victorian age, now the poor are starting to vote. Now the working class are starting to vote. And there was this fear among Victorians that their political power was being usurped, right? If 10 people could vote, each one of those people had 10% of the political power. Now, if another 10 people are allowed to vote, and it's up to 20, you still have a vote. Nobody's taking your vote away. But now your vote is only worth 5% of what it was before. You still have a vote, but it's just not worth as much. The Victorians were anxious about this expansion of political power, of voting rights, precisely because they felt like their political power was being diminished. They didn't have the same sort of power politically they used to have. And there was a new generation of politicians, and we talked about this before, that were increasingly appealing to voters, particularly the poor and working class voters, based on the argument, I'm not better than you, I'm not wiser than you, I am just like you. So therefore, you should vote for me because I understand your life, I understand your circumstances. I will make decisions that will help you because I understand your life. For the Victorians, they were increasingly fearful that there were going to be kind of demagogic politicians who are not going to do what's good for the people, but simply rile up support for from the poor and the working class, and do things that are bad for the wealthy and the middle class, and just do things to advantage the poor and the working class. For example, raise taxes on the rich, raise taxes on the middle class to help the poor and working class. For the Victorians, this was not an appealing prospect, at least not most of them. All right? And so you might be asking at this point, okay, well, what's the con? What's the con? Money isn't being stolen from these people. The con is that your vote is being taken. A demagogic politician increasingly trying to appeal to the poor and the working class will use fear to elicit support from the poor and the working class, to try and steal their vote, to try and unfairly con them out of their political vote. And then once in office, do bad things, make bad decisions, be corrupt themselves. That was the con. It's not the con in the way we would traditionally think about it. It's the con where a politician pretends to be one thing to gain office, but then once they get into office, they don't really follow through in terms of any of their promises, that they're really con artists. It's just the idea of the politician as a con artist, pretending to be one thing to get the confidence of the voter, and then once in office, conning them, not really doing what they promised to do. So, if the urban companion represent fear of social change, decline of social control over the younger generation, and if the gambler represented fear of economic change, the demagogue represented fear of political change. This again is why we spent so much time at the beginning of this unit talking about 19th century change. So much of what Haltunen's interested in her book is how Victorian Americans were responding to change. And because change, as we live in real time in our present life, is often difficult to comprehend, we sometimes project our fear of change onto something we can understand. And so the Victorians projected their fear of social change, of economic change, of political change. They projected it onto conmen, the urban companion, the gambler, their demagogue. But what was really going on was a broader scale fear of social change, political change, economic change. Okay. As we go on with these lectures, we'll continue to talk about this and these changes and the way that con men figure into this subject matter. Okay, everybody. That's it for this lecture. I'll see you next time. Take care. Bye.